Is there a plan? Is there anybody actually in control?
Yeah, knowledge is power.
Artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent.
Politicians are far more worried now about addressing their followers than they are addressing their constituents.
Saying memes are almost like the new nuclear weapon. Welcome to the first episode of The Plan, Decode the Future. My background is one of branding expertise, writer and musician. And Ben, just tell us a little bit about yourself and the idea of what The Plan is as we go forward hosting this podcast.
So thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. We came up with this idea, The Plan, because it seemed to both of us that the ideas that are circulating in society are really radically different to the ideas that were circulating 5 or 10 years ago. We seem to be in a situation where there's a kind of bewildering amount of new ideas and where things seem to in some way be going faster than before in terms of how ideas are changing. A lot of the old ideas that were around 10 years ago seem to be pretty dead for most people, I think. And it's a number of changes, some of them technological, some of them around narratives and ideology and ideas, and they all seem to be kind of converging in a way that seems to make the world look like a place that's moving very, very fast all of a sudden. So that was the kind of thinking behind this, and then in particular there's some kind of radical ideas which I think are circulating amongst governments and rulers and political figures, but also intellectuals and cultural figures. Which I think really need kind of closer examination. There's a sense that there's a lot out there, but people are not necessarily engaging or aware of the ideas that are out there. I come from a background of politics, so I studied political science at university. I was a journalist for a long time and an analyst. I'm a writer as well, but I've also been a business leader. I've been a political advisor to governments and political movements as well, and so I've always been very acutely aware of ideas and narratives and how they affect what's happening in the real world. So that's a little bit where we're coming from. Why the plan? Well, first of all, I mean, is there a plan? It strikes me there's very rapid change. There's a lot going on which is bewildering and new. And sometimes slightly scary. Is there something behind it? Is there a plan, or is it random? So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is, can people have a plan in this new situation? Is there a plan that can take people forward in some way to help them understand what's happening?
Yeah, and I think within all this, like so, with any of these types of movements or these plans where things are going forwards, there is always some sort of kind of catalyst. But I think the catalyst that we're seeing now over the last 10 years is fundamentally different from anything else we've seen before in history. And some of that may be because of the technological advances, those kind of influences, or key speakers or people who are looking for some sort of kind of tribalism, trying to join certain tribes to get their voices kind of heard. So hopefully over the episodes that are coming out over one each week, basically, we can delve into those a little bit deeper, see who's behind these plans or not so the plans, and go from there. And I think, it goes down to as well in terms of there's been a lot of terms being coined recently over the last sort of decade or so, and it's who's really behind this, where is it coming from? What are your initial views on what is the driving catalyst for this?
Well, I think the first thing is that we're in a moment of very rapid technological change, and particularly technological change as it affects perception, people's understanding. So, communication technologies, how we receive information and how we use that information change radically. The old media organizations are less relevant. The way that we consume information is completely different, but also the way that information is created now, increasingly through AI, and increasingly kind of constructed in a different way through things like memes, very short form messages, visual ideas, and so on. It's really different from the world that we lived in 20 years ago, and that has political consequences, and that has cultural consequences.
I was about to say, I suppose also now we're seeing that there's a lot of lobbying coming from the technology side as well, who implant themselves within governments around the world as well, and that's probably sort of helping to steamroll a lot of these ideas through, I think, especially under different sort of administrations and things like that. And we're seeing this kind of process where, this technological advance is something which is kind of being pushed forward by a few rather than the masses, but it's affecting the masses as a whole. And to be able to kind of give that knowledge base out to those people who are listening to the podcast or viewing the podcast is essentially what we're sort of trying to do here, and to help kind of educate based on a bookend of research that ourselves have basically been doing.
Yeah, really important. I mean, it starts with understanding, right? Yeah, knowledge is power, as the old adage goes. And I feel one of the things that's interesting at the moment is that ideas, seem to kind of come along with a sense of inevitability. We've gone from kind of consuming media through lots and lots of different mechanisms, whether that's newspapers or records or tapes or radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts, and so on, to essentially receiving one stream of content through a single device, normally through the mobile phone, right? And that's had huge impacts. And then we have these technologies that are being introduced, AI, the most important, which are just presented as inevitable, right? So everybody has to just get with the future as defined by a few commentators and corporate figures, which is, AI is essentially going to be pretty much everything, and somehow we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but somehow we have to get with the program and start adapting to it. And I saw something interesting the other day. The former Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, who's always had this kind of slightly kind of brutal realist approach to many issues in world politics. He essentially said, we have to adapt politics to the AI. He said the AI is going to change everything, how society's set up and how democracy runs, and really the politics have to adapt to the AI. And I thought that was a really interesting idea because, I mean, it's not very democratic. It's essentially saying that the AI or the technological paradigm decides, and we have to adapt the politics to that.
I suppose there's a discussion as well as, like, is the AI already adapted to something already? I mean, there's this conversation which goes, the idea that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent, and that it's kind of working off a premise of dictates from those who are behind the initial programming, So it's something already kind of deeply embedded in that we need to be aware of. And I think the thing that gets me as well is that in today's society, you were talking about sort of like legacy media, which would kind of drive to our ways of thinking. It feels that now the narrative can be more dictated due to the algorithms of these kind of techno empires, keeping you within certain echo chambers, using you as a basis to create false debates, so to speak, using bots, all those kind of things. And I wonder if, as you were saying before when you were talking about plan, is there a plan? Is there anybody actually in control, or have the gods or the creators of this plan lost control and not really understand what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting, right? Because the AI in itself, it is, as we know it now, is mainly these large language models, but it's the inputs and the training. There's someone behind this, right? It's not just happening on its own. And then behind that, there's huge, investments, corporate power, infrastructure, huge data center, and the investments that are going into it, the energy that's being used. So kind of how the AI is set up and what comes out the other end, I would argue really strongly, we've got to stop seeing it as a thing. It's about what's behind the AI and who controls it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bias there from what we've seen with the AI as well. And again, we're going back to sort of the coining of words. We're seeing a lot of these guys who've been fundamental godfathers of AI coining it as the new species, and whether that's a method of fear-mongering or whether it's trying to get people onto the same page as to how big and how controlling this thing is actually going to be, whereas you have one part of the divide seeing AI as a tool to be used for the future, and another side seeing it as, a dystopia, and it's kind of interesting to see which kind of lines people sort of go down depending on which echo chamber they're in. Is there a particular camp that you feel that you're veering towards, or which it's being dictated to?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that technologies, in themselves can be used for different purposes. And we've seen that throughout the history of the human race. And the mood around technology, changes. So, I mean, you can go from a kind of optimistic kind of vision around nuclear power, for instance, that existed in the 1950s and 60s, towards then ending up with a very dystopian view of what nuclear power was. By the time you get to the 80s and you've been through the accidents, and you've been through 3 Mile Island, you've been through Chernobyl, you get to a point of view where you get to a point where nuclear is actually seen as something fairly dystopian, deep state, dangerous, and so on. And I think society, constantly is changing its view on the technologies, depending on how they're being used, but also who controls them, and to what extent people feel that they can have some modicum of control in their everyday lives. And I would argue some technologies are more democratic than others, in the sense that some are more able to be controlled by more people. But again, it's how you set things up. So with AI, for instance, it's really interesting. I'm not a technical expert, but I've read a lot around it, and I try and keep up with the debate. I mean, AI models can be multiple, they can be diverse, and they can be trained in different ways, and they can be more or less open source or not open source. And I think what's happening now is that the model seems to be accelerating towards essentially a kind of corporate, kind of imperial model. So the AI becomes a kind of empire, which is about massive computing power, who's got the financial resources to do that, but also about intellectual property and the ability to be able to scrape intellectual property from around the world and use it for your own commercial model.
We're seeing that a lot now, especially sort of the artistic front, whether it's either through music or design. The law of copyright now being extended for AI to use that. And I think one of the other opposing threats that we have, obviously we know from history sort of how propaganda spreads and how long it normally takes to spread. But with the technological advances and the growth of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, it's like, how do people now go about finding the truth? Because we've also seen sort of areas where some of these large language models, which people are actually using as search devices, are doubling down on things where they're saying things which are incorrect or wrong, but people are going away and believing that as a truth. And whether those things are intentionally programmed as a misguidance or not, we don't know yet. So where do we go to kind of find the truth? I'd hope that people would sort of come to the plan to be able to sort of take what they want from this and sort of develop their own mindset. But what's your visioning on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the on this podcast, I think it's a very good point. I mean, we want to give people the tools so that they can understand what's happening to them and what's going on in the wider world. And it does require thinking. Part of the problem I see at the moment is people are abdicating thinking. So people are passing their own thinking onto a third party, ChatGPT mainly, but other mechanisms as well. And so what's happening is that people are essentially not using their ability to think and figure things out, or they're thinking in a way that's so fast. And we'll go into this maybe in some of the episodes, but there's this concept of shallow thinking, which is thinking at speed and kind of overloading your short-term memory, which we're very good at doing as human beings, and it's very necessary to have that kind of instinctual ability to kind of go up and down and take in ideas and lots of different impressions and stimuli all at once. But unless you're able to then turn that into kind of deeper insights, it can leave you in a situation where you can't really figure out what's happening. And I think with, again, going back to what's happened, I mean, there's a US academic called Nicholas Carr, who I really like. He's written a couple of books. One's called The Shallows, another's called Superbloom that just came out. And he looks at a lot of the ideas around social media. A lot of what is happening in social media is not new, but there are new things. And one of the moments he identifies is when Facebook, I think it's in 2006, they changed to the newsfeed. So the point he makes is that if you were on Facebook pre-2006, it was pretty much doing what you do in normal social life. So you would visit a friend's page,
sure,
and you would say, okay, I want to go and visit this friend and see what they're up to, and then you'd look at their pictures and see where they'd been, and then you'd go and say, oh, I wonder what Sammy over the road is doing, and then you go and look at that. And if you wanted to look at a neighbourhood group, you go and visit and look at those pictures. That changed with the introduction of the newsfeed. The newsfeed effectively organised your feed, and the algorithm started showing you what it thought you needed to see. So instead of being this kind of curated, approach where you were using your own kind of energy and choice to see what you were looking at, suddenly you were being given a feed. And I think it's a very important historical moment. And I think now, looking back now, it seems quaint because pretty much everything we're consuming now is through feeds.
But I suppose when you go further back then and you look at the actual foundation of Facebook, or the Facebook as it was then, and sort of its initial purpose, what Mark Zuckerberg saw as, who's hot, who's not kind of list against sort of university campuses, building a foundation of something which was people being seen influentially by, how people sort of like kind of ticking people off the list. It's kind of kept that same narrative but exploded. But also the word news as well is very appealing to me these days as well, because even when we've seen sort of like legacy media, there seems to be a lot less news driven stuff and they seem to be more opinion pieces, but you can only see that if you're really looking for that, in the same way as if you have somebody sitting behind a camera, any kind of influencer, they're seen as an expert on something, and you tend to find that a lot of people don't do that extra research and go and look at another 3, 4, 5 sources, play devil's advocate and see what is actual truth. Like you're saying, that initial dopamine hit of, right, I know something, I'm going to go and tell my next friend about this, and the word of mouth becomes very, very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, though, celebrity becomes the proof, right? And popularity becomes the proof. I mean, politicians are far more worried now about addressing their followers than they are addressing their constituents. And that's a really important change. It is essentially, it's the brutal maths of who's got the most followers that kind of decides on how much of a share of the voice and of the truth that you're able to command.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at Donald Trump, the current president of the US. He's just simply got a very big platform, and that allows him to pretty much say what he wants to say.
Well, funnily enough, I remember seeing an interview a while ago with Elon, but when he was confronted about what sort of is the new sort of problems going forward, he was basically saying memes are almost like the new nuclear weapon. Because you control memes, you can control the minds, you can control the masses. It brings us into that whole kind of idea of algorithms and the matrix and the guidance and the plans and, the decoding of all this kind of stuff. And also we can go deep down the dark rabbit hole and, put all episodes into sort of kind of one thing. But I think sometimes when the people who are behind these large establishments slip up like that, I think that's when we really need to sort of sit up and take notice, because it quite often goes under the radar,
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I mean, perhaps one of the themes in this podcast that we'll talk about a lot in the coming episodes is around the way that science fiction has been and is such a big influence over the people who are ruling the world now. And I mean, these people are literally seeing the movies where they hack into your brain and they, control the matrix, and you're living in an alternative reality that somebody controls. I mean, they've seen these movies, they live and breathe them. And in a way, they want to emulate them. I mean, this is one of the interesting things.
Yeah, I think that they say science fiction to science fact. And I know there are some universities actually that preside in the States where the whole purpose of their curriculum is to look at sci-fi movies and think how they're going to develop that, how they can develop the next Skynet, or how they're going to develop the next architect of the Matrix, all these kind of things. So, and I think we can kind of see that reflection, especially if you look at like some of the new things that are coming out with AI. We have these agent AIs. Where did that terminology, the agent, come from? Well, the Matrix has all these different so they're categorically looking at these things, and they're using science fiction to become, the science fad. So I think, one of the things we should look at, especially in the first episode, is probably look at maybe one or two of these terms that have been coined recently, which may be acting as this kind of catalyst for change, whether positive or negative, and what our viewpoints may or may not be on that, just so the audience can actually have a devil's advocate on it. So is there anything particular that you feel that we should start with in terms of anything that the phrasing that's come up quite a lot is things like the Dark Enlightenment. Where did that phrase come from? What's it about? And why is it getting so much airplay and frequency now?
Yeah, I think what I'm really excited about is digging into some of these big ideas that are circulating. I feel there hasn't been enough engagement, frankly. I think the ideas are hiding in plain sight. They're only a Google search away, or in fact, many of the people who are professing these ideas and putting forward these ideas are doing so completely openly. It's not a secret.
It's very brazen.
It's not a secret that Elon Musk and the people around him are influenced by these ideas around dark enlightenment, for instance. Elon Musk shows up at the White House with a dark MAGA, baseball cap on, basically a black MAGA hat, and he says, "This is dark MAGA," and kind of waving his arms around, and as he does. But it's kind of, what does he mean by that? It's quite, and I think people don't really dig into it. They see this and they think, okay, or he shows up at the conservative, what's it called, the Conservative Action. The big conservative conference they have every year in the US. I think it's CPAC, I think it's called. And he shows up with his chainsaw that the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, had given him. So he starts up this chainsaw on the stage with loud music, and he starts shouting, "I am become meme," to the audience, who are all clapping and cheering wildly, right? So these people are really aware of all these kind of ideas, and they are people who are in some ways, often, brilliant in some way, but also hugely influenced by science fiction and thinking about the future. And they're thinking big picture. And I think one of the things that's interesting, and again, we can dig into this, is that the traditional kind of center politicians, the left, your traditional kind of center-right, center-left political establishment, they're not thinking like that. They're very much thinking about how do we slow things down, or how do we kind of, it's about guardrails, or how do we make things reasonable, and or how do we try and mitigate the impact of different things that happen in society. And these guys are the opposite. They're just saying let it rip. They're saying not just let it rip, but let's just see what we can go out and do. Whether it's good or bad, you don't always know. But they're basically saying let's just go out and change.
Yeah, it's just what I always wonder, if there's some sort of kind of underlying body globally that's doing something. Since sort of times of Brexit or the first Trump administration, we've seen the celebrity has taken the status of like the court jester taking the throne, and it's almost becomes like a smoke and mirrors. If somebody is if somebody's put in, if they seem charming enough, or they seem like a buffoon, or they seem that kind of celebrity, then they're going to get more engagement. People are going to be more on side, rather than understanding the values of what they're trying to profess or push through. We've seen that with Boris, we've seen that with Trump, we see that with Elon, and a lot of it feels that, the way that these ideas are delivered in terms of progression for the masses, whereas when you really delve into it and look at it, it's not necessarily our utopia, but theirs, or their vision, whether their utopia is that of an AI world, or whether they just want to see the world burn, or whether they've just gotten too much power and it becomes a different type of game, a game of risk for them, because you can only buy so many watches and so many cars. So what do you play with next,
Yeah, absolutely. I'm struck in a way that their lives of some of these figures, I mean, they've amassed such incredible power and financial resources that in many ways they can do what they like, but then still with the same frustration of kind of limitations around them, right? So they want to break the boundaries all the time. And one thing that's really interesting is that, and again going back to science fiction, is that ideas or science fiction films which start off as a kind of warning, so written as a dystopia of kind of don't do this.
So would you immediately go to your 1984 for that?
1984, but also The Matrix, Terminator is a classic one, right? Yeah. So I mean, maybe take a couple of those ones. I mean, The Matrix and the Terminator. I mean, they are almost like films saying, we don't want this. Do not do this. But at the same time, there's a sense, well, actually, let's do this. Right? And what starts off as a warning, kind of 20 years later, we're actually trying to do almost exactly the same stuff, right? That we know we shouldn't do. Sure. So we're doing, Cyberdyne systems and the Golden Dome, and we're doing Neuralink, and we're controlling people's information, and through algorithms we're putting out massive kind of experiments in terms of spreading fake news and so on, and all these things. So kind of in a way it's interesting, because science fiction is like a sounding board, where a kind of something which is dystopian, and these are words I think we'll use a lot during the podcast, then turns into something where actually we end up doing it anyway. And I'd really like to dig into those dynamics of kind of this sense of we're just going there anyway. Even though we know it's kind of bad, we're just going to go there.
I think it's sort of kind of defining what progression is in different people's eyes in terms of what their personal truths of what progression is. If you look in terms of, as we look at like the Elons of the world or the technocrats of the world, where they see us almost kind of the masses living on a certain type of system. Everyone's living a free life. Everyone's got everything that they want. But then you have also the flip side of progression, which could be us actually living in harmony with nature, actually trying to save the planet and not trying to escape on these phallic symbols to Mars or wherever it may be, kind of thing. So I think definition plays a very important part in terms of how things are perceived. I mean, we see that in the way sort of kind of bots interact on sort of like YouTube comments and stuff like that. We see that, if we're watching the same video, the comments that you may see may be fundamentally different to what I see. And so there's a bit of programming that's been going on the same way that we've been programmed all our lives, whether it's via our parents, whether it's via marketing. It's now, I did a talk a few years back in Scotland about how the big brands are moving away and it's becoming more about the personal brand. And what I meant by that was that constructing brands, say for example, take Coke for example, it's very recognizable. It's got its swoosh, it's red and it's white. But for example, the color red may be triggering to you. But based on the algorithms and the data collection that I'm getting, you could love the color yellow. So the Coca-Cola advert you see is using yellow instead of red, and suddenly it's appealing to you. And little nuanced information like that, which finds its way through via IP addresses, is what's kind of, I feel, being used to program us in the idea of making us believe that certain things are progressive and for the better good of ourselves. But it's moving at such an exponential rate. I fear that by the time people catch up with what's kind of going on, what the ideas are, they're going to be too far left behind.
Yeah. Many of these ideas obviously start with advertising, and they're around in the 1950s and 60s, Mad Men, The Hidden Persuaders, all these kind of ideas. And essentially US advertising taking on the insights of psychoanalysis. And obviously there's a direct connection through the Freud's some of Freud's kind of offspring into the PR business essentially. So what we see is this kind of idea of kind of creating a science of manipulation, through marketing. What's different now is that the delivery mechanism is completely different and is able to provide or supply content on a huge kind of ubiquitous and constant level, and constant and content creation that is just endless. But also their ability to be able to monitor reaction, right? So being able to calibrate almost in real time how you're reacting to certain stimuli, products, colors, as you say, and so on. That I would argue that's kind of the idea was already there. Like of how do we manipulate people to sell stuff, and then also how do we manipulate people to get them to behave in a certain way as citizens, and live through things like the nuclear crisis and kind of deal with this kind of reality. But now we're in a world where like both the delivery mechanism, the content creation, and the ability to be able to monitor people is on a completely new level.
Return on investment on that is just kind of ridiculous in terms of data analytics. I mean, as well, going back to, there's a marriage between that advertising and that science fiction filmscape that we talk about. I mean, not mention any films or any of the brands that are named within there, but there are certain very well-known brands who have appeared in science fiction films who have said, well, you can only use our product if it's on the side of the protagonist. So we want to be seen as to being, on the good side, the right side of history. And it's got that nuanced program that when we think about certain films or movies, we can kind of see that association. And the interesting thing with some of those organisations who purport not to be Big Brother, who over the last 10 years have actually, in fact, become the Big Brother, have placed themselves in the minds of others as being on the side of good, that, everything that they, do is private. Everything that they do is about, saving the consumer or looking after the consumer, which is not necessarily the case. So, and that goes back into that whole idea of, the tribalism and people saying, right, if I've got this, then I must be on the side of good, and how do we determine that? And is, the same way you say, is there a plan or is there not? Is there a right side or is there a wrong side? Is there a left side or is there a right side? And whether the ideas now that are coming to the forefront that are being proposed, are they new ideas or are they reworking of old ideas, both not just from science fiction, but from the brutal histories of humankind.
Yeah, again, I think it's a really important point. I mean, none of these ideas are new per se, but they're being recycled in a much more powerful way in new contexts and with kind of new cultural narratives. So, I mean, for instance, the idea of social Darwinism, late 19th century idea, is essentially that might is right, and if you're successful in some way, that's because you're biologically set up to be successful. So yeah, the best win, and the best win because they're the best, essentially. So there's this kind of circular argument around power and being successful justifies you being
Sure.
powerful, right? Used to essentially justify British imperialism and then German imperialism, in that whole dark period, the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century.
It's the idea of so the idea of that kind of same idea that kind of monarchy stands upon, that they've got this divine choice. By God, they have the power, they have this, so they should accumulate all the wealth.
Yeah, but I guess what the reason these ideas are being circulated now is because you have this elite that's emerged, incredibly successful and amassed financial power that I don't think any era of the world has ever seen. This kind of financial power or this level of inequality as well in terms of distribution of wealth and property, right? Fueled by an asset boom over the last 15 years. And copious amounts of credit and fictitious capital, and they need to justify this somehow, right? And then it's also mixed with this whole idea of the kind of technological elite. So these are essentially the coders, and the people who are able to manipulate the code. And so those ideas kind of merge between the kind of brilliant, the brilliant person who's able to figure out this world of code, and it's Bill Gates or it's Elon Musk, whoever it is, and then the idea that these people have justifiably huge amounts of financial resources and resources allocated to them in society, and those ideas fuse in these kind of really kind of social Darwinist type ideas, and we'll see this in the first two episodes that we do, particularly this idea around dark enlightenment, but also kind of ideas around kind of eugenics and who controls society. And the idea of the network state, and also the idea, essentially of the techno monarch. So it's, the idea that you have this kind of techno king, who's just somebody who's just so wise or technologically savvy that they need to make decisions without the constraint of ordinary people and democracy holding them back. And those are really powerful ideas. They're not new. I mean, they go from social Darwinism, they go through people like Ayn Rand, the writer in the sort of 1920s kind of era. America is all about the rugged individual and the successful business person, and these are now recycled as kind of technologically based ideas.
And I suppose whether they're trying to be seen as these techno monarchs, or whether it's more of a panoply or a cartel that's under all of this, like a techno cartel, so to speak. So I think it would be quite good to sort of try and dive into the weeds of it on the first episode and go from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But maybe just to go back, what you were saying, Simon, about what's right, what's wrong. Who controls technology and should they be controlling it, and ultimately who decides the narrative and the reality. I mean, for me, what's important is that people are able to make their own decisions, and that ordinary human beings are able to have information which is in some level objective, has some relationship to truth in a way which is useful and functional. And then be able to exercise decisions around that. And I think this situation we're in now, where essentially people are living in either kind of echo chambers or kind of information bubbles, they've been called, where there's a sense that information is being controlled somewhere else by someone, and that we don't have access to reality, the actual reality itself. I think it's a very important moment for. Yeah. For people, and that's why, I mean, for instance, one of the things we'll talk about is the rise of the conspiracy theory. I mean, the conspiracy theory now is a way of looking at things that many people subscribe to, maybe most people subscribe to, right? It's not just a conspiracy theory or one or another conspiracy theory. It's a way of looking at the world. And it's a way of looking at the world which is fundamentally alienated and alienating, because the idea behind it is we can't have direct access to the truth, and B, somebody else is manipulating the truth, and there's something else going on that only a few people can know about, right? And that the reality as we see it, that's not the reality. And I think it's a very disempowering idea in many ways. It's good in the sense that if it can provoke people to look critically at things, that's great. But I'd argue it's gone beyond that. It's now basically a fundamental kind of doubt that we can understand society at all. And in that world, the biggest platform and the loudest voice wins, and quite often the most atavistic ideas win. And by that I mean, what provokes fear and insecurity, the sense of the other, sense of something going on which may not be pleasant that somebody else controls. Those kind of instincts seem to kind of prevail in that world of conspiracy.
And you have the other issue as well, where there's a large portion of the world who may not be able to hear this podcast or see this podcast, who are fundamentally going to be affected by a lot of these changes that are happening now, that once they do get the technology in their hands, there'll be a dictate there already, and it's how you get that message out. And the only way to do that is by sort of kind of trying to change the narrative or open the narrative to the way people think now about what's kind of going on,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no point fighting yesterday's battles or talking the language of yesteryear. But I think it's a genuine problem in this world of ubiquitous information and an essentially unlimited content stream. How does anyone, how do the voices get heard? And again, he or she, and it's normally he who has the biggest platform, gets heard. And they, the billionaires figured that out, quite a long time ago. Which is why Elon bought X, Twitter. X changed the algorithms. That's why, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, etc. Right? It's who's got the biggest platform. It's why Donald Trump set up his own platform, which amongst his followers is where they go to first, right?
Yeah, the squeaky wheel makes the most noise, essentially. So cool.
So we've talked a little bit about the podcast, and how we're going to go forward with it. I'm hoping we can really dig into some of these ideas, over the course of the next kind of 10 or 12 episodes. First of all, I think, at a level of ideas, but I think also always looking at the level of what's happening in the real world, and where are power relations changing as well, along with these ideas.